Welcome to Quiet Historian, where we close our eyes, listen, and fall asleep to quiet history, myths, and legends. I'm your narrator for the night, equal parts history nerd and pillow enthusiast. Tonight, you're drifting back through a century's most restless dream, one of courage and cruelty, of invention and endurance, a war that reshaped the planet, one quiet fact at a time. There are no battle cries here, only echoes, the murmurs of history beneath the hum of rain and the pulse of sleep. Let your breathing slow as we begin 150 fascinating World War II facts, stories of shadows, science, sorrow, and survival. The war is long over now, but its whispers remain. Before we begin, if you truly enjoy these stories, hitting like or subscribe helps me keep making them, and hopefully helps you keep drifting off. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. I'm always amazed by the places people tune in. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath in, and let it out. Because once this story begins, chances are you'll be asleep before it ends. Russia's endless winter of loss. Across the Russian front, 21 million lives were lost. Families vanished beneath snowdrifts and rubble. Villages burned, trains froze in motion, and soldiers disappeared into blizzards that felt endless. The land itself became a graveyard that stretched beyond sight, where even silence seemed to mourn. Those who survived did so on crumbs, courage, and something colder than fear. From that frozen vastness, history drifted westward, where even darker shadows awaited. The children who never grew up. Nearly 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust. Some were hidden in cupboards or cellars, some in forests that whispered lullabies through the trees. A few were saved by strangers, many more by miracles that never came. Their laughter vanished into ash and echo, leaving behind only names on small stones. As their voices faded, another tragedy was still unfolding in the camps, built to erase entire worlds. Bergen-Belson's hollow silence. When Allied troops entered Bergen-Belsen, they found a landscape of ghosts. Over 13,000 died, even after liberation, too starved to recover. The smell of smoke, disease, and death clung to every surface. British soldiers buried bodies by the thousands, then burned the camp to prevent further plague. Liberation came, but not salvation. Freedom, for many, was simply the chance to die in open air. The war that never truly ended. Some say World War II began in 1939 with Poland's invasion. Others claim it started in 1931 when Japan seized Manchuria. But perhaps it never really ended, just shifted form. Old resentments became new ambitions, and soldiers carried scars into the next conflict, disguised as peace. The world learned how to pause between wars, not how to stop them. And as one empire fell, another prepared its engines. Leningrad's starving symphony For 900 days, Leningrad held out under siege. Citizens boiled wallpaper for starch, ate sawdust and glue, and still refused to surrender. A symphony played in defiance while bombs fell, the notes trembling with hunger and pride. When the siege lifted, more than 1 million had died, yet the music survived. Even in ruin, the city hummed, a melody against despair. The courage of Denmark. In 1943, Denmark's citizens learned their Jewish neighbors would be arrested. Fishermen and farmers risked execution to ferry them across the sea to Sweden. Of nearly 8,000 Jews, over 7,000 escaped. The Nazis arrived to find empty homes, dinner tables still set. It was one of humanity's rarest moments, when goodness moved faster than evil. The Warsaw Uprising. Warsaw rose in defiance, armed with little more than hope and stolen rifles. For 63 days, civilians fought tanks with courage and fire. When the city fell, the Nazis razed 90% of it, house by house. The rubble became a monument to stubborn freedom. And from that dust, Poland's spirit never truly died. The day peace still felt like death. When concentration camps were liberated, many survivors were too frail to live. Doctors fed them gently, but their bodies rejected mercy. The war had already taken what food could not restore. Nurses wept beside their beds, whispering lullabies to people older than suffering itself. It taught the world that victory and peace are never the same thing. The statistics of grief: between 50 and 70 million lives were lost in the war. More than half were civilians, erased without ceremony. Entire villages vanished. Maps had to be redrawn just to mark the silence. The numbers are easy to count, but impossible to imagine. Each digit hides a face, a laugh, a bedtime story unfinished. War turned arithmetic into mourning. The human echo. Even the victors could not escape the cost. Empty chairs lingered in kitchens across the world. Grief became a second shadow that followed every nation into its rebuilding. The medals and parades faded, but the quiet memories did not. Every survivor carried both pride and guilt, two sides of the same medal. And from that silence, new kinds of power began to rise. Factories of fire. From 1940 to 1945, the United States transformed its industry into a war machine. Factories built 7 million rifles, 89,000 tanks, and over 300,000 aircraft. Assembly lines that once made cars now forged engines for destruction. Women filled the roles of men gone to battle, their hands turning steel into survival. But behind every victory, smoke and exhaustion clouded the air. Soldiers of paper and code. In 1943, mathematicians and linguists gathered to fight a silent war, the Battle of Encryption. Hidden in huts at Bletchley Park, they worked tirelessly to break Nazi codes, Their success with the Enigma machine shortened the war by years. They fought with pencils instead of pistols, proving that brilliance could be as lethal as bombs. And so began a new front, science itself as a weapon. The invisible soldiers. Across the Pacific, Native American code talkers sent messages in their own languages. The Navajo language became an unbreakable cipher, baffling Japanese intelligence. Their words, once suppressed by schools, became the key to saving thousands. Every whisper on the radio was a heartbeat of victory. In that irony, history found a rare moment of poetic justice. The shadow of the kamikaze. In the war's final years, Japan turned desperation into sacrifice. Kamikaze pilots were told they carried the soul of the empire. They crashed their planes into Allied ships, sinking 34 vessels and killing nearly 5,000 sailors. They wrote poems before takeoff, sometimes weeping, sometimes smiling. Their deaths marked the moment when faith in victory became faith in martyrdom. Death rays and radar. In 1935, a British engineer named Robert Watson Watt was asked to build a death ray. Instead, he created radar, a system that would save Britain from destruction. Invisible waves replaced bullets, mapping the sky with light no eye could see. When the Blitz began, radar warned cities before the bombs arrived. It was science repurposed from myth into survival. And with that, the war entered its next phase, an age of invention where every discovery carried both hope and horror. The whispering machines of Bletchley. In quiet huts tucked behind English hedgerows, codebreakers turned chaos into pattern. They intercepted messages filled with ciphers, so tangled they seemed unbreakable. Alan Turing and his team built mechanical minds, early computers, to think faster than any man. Each click of the Enigma rotor was answered by another click of resistance. From their secrecy came the first glimmer of the digital age. The jet that arrived too late. Germany's Me-262 was the first jet fighter to scream through the sky. It could outrun anything the Allies had, slicing air like lightning, but Hitler delayed its production, demanding it carry bombs instead of guns. By the time it reached battle, the war was already dying. The machine that could have changed history arrived only to witness its own defeat. Karl the Giant Gun. Among Germany's monstrous weapons stood one simply called Karl. It fired shells heavier than a truck, capable of shattering concrete like glass. Soldiers felt its thunder miles away. Buildings trembled before the shell even landed. Yet Karl's roar was too slow for a war moving at jet speed. The future was not in weight, but in speed and thought. Broad-assed Marines and hairy-assed humor. Amid grim days, soldiers still laughed. Women in the US Marines were nicknamed broad-assed Marines. They answered by calling the men hairy-assed Marines. It was defiance wrapped in humor, a small rebellion against the seriousness of war. Even laughter became a weapon against despair. The Kiddie Salon. In Berlin, the SS opened a brothel called the Kiddie Salon. The rooms were wired, the conversations recorded, and the clients were diplomats and officers. The women were trained to draw secrets from pillow talk. War had found its way into whispers and sighs. Intimacy became intelligence. Inflatable armies. The Allies crafted ghost armies from rubber and sound. They inflated decoy tanks, blasted fake radio chatter, and projected engine noise through hidden speakers. From above, it looked like an invasion force. German scouts reported movements that didn't exist, chasing phantoms across maps. Deception became one of the most effective weapons of all. Liberty Steaks and Victory Gardens. At home, hamburgers were renamed Liberty Steaks to sound less German. Citizens planted gardens in backyards, schoolyards, and city squares to feed themselves and soldiers alike. Each seed was a quiet protest against ration books. By war's end, these small plots produced millions of tons of food. Hope could grow even in borrowed soil. The Blonde Knight. Erich Hartmann was Germany's deadliest pilot, credited with 352 kills. They called him the Blonde Knight, though his sky was always grey. He survived over 1,400 missions, yet never lost the boyish grin seen in photos. After the war, he was imprisoned by the Soviets for 10 years. A legend grounded by the weight of survival. The Mad Flight of Rudolf Hess. In 1941, Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess flew alone to Scotland. He believed he could negotiate peace with Britain. Instead, he crashed, was arrested, and spent the rest of his life in prison. Even Hitler disowned him, calling him insane. Some flights never land where they're meant to. The Harvard March. The Nazis stole the melody of Harvard's fight song for their Sieg Heil parade music. Composers who once wrote for joy now wrote for terror. The rhythm of education became the drumbeat of control. It was proof that even music could be conquered, repurposed, and corrupted. When sound obeys fear, silence becomes rebellion. Book burners. In 1933, German students piled books in the streets and set them ablaze. They called it purification, removing un-German ideas. Einstein, Freud, Wells, and Mann burned together in the orange glow. A century earlier, a poet had warned, where they burn books, they will burn people. And soon they did. The island that might have been hell. Before choosing extermination camps, Nazi planners considered deporting Europe's Jews to Madagascar. They drew maps and shipping routes, as if cruelty could be bureaucratic. The idea collapsed under its own absurdity, replaced by something worse. It showed that genocide began not with bullets, but paperwork. Ink was the first weapon. The man who warned about Pearl Harbor, a Yugoslav spy named Duško Popov, real-life inspiration for James Bond, told the FBI Japan was planning an airstrike. They ignored him. When Pearl Harbor burned months later, he said nothing. He lived out his days in a penthouse, drinking champagne with regret. Even heroes learn that truth is useless when no one listens. The Japanese balloons. Japan launched 9,000 paper balloons carrying bombs across the Pacific. They floated on jet streams, drifting toward the American West Coast. Most caused only curiosity, but one killed a pregnant woman and 5 children on a picnic. The military censored the news to prevent panic. The wind itself had become a soldier. The sacred swastika. Long before Hitler twisted it, the swastika meant good fortune. It adorned temples in India, coins in Greece, and pottery in China. Its name came from Sanskrit, su asti, meaning well-being. War poisoned even ancient symbols, turning blessings into curses. Some wounds, it seems, scar language itself. The blood road of Stalingrad. In the ruins of Stalingrad, every brick was contested. Snipers nested in stairwells, tanks burned in snow, and soldiers fought room by room for 6 endless months. Over 2 million were killed or wounded before the German army finally surrendered. The Volga River froze around the dead. From that victory, Russia began to turn the tide of the war. The Desert Fox. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps swept across the Sahara like a sandstorm. He treated prisoners humanely, earning respect even from enemies. Yet supply lines strangled him, and Allied deception lured his tanks into empty dunes. By 1943, the desert that once hid his triumphs swallowed his army whole. Rommel's legend endured long after the sands cooled. The Screaming Sky. German dive bombers, called Stukas, carried sirens on their wings. Their scream sent civilians running before the bombs even fell. The sound was psychological warfare, a manufactured terror. When those sirens finally ceased, silence itself became suspicious. Fear had found a voice. The longest battle. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted 6 years, longer than any other. Allied ships raced to feed Britain, while German U-boats stalked them beneath black waves. Convoys sailed through storms and submarines like floating graveyards. By war's end, 2,000 ships were sunk, but the lifeline held. Victory came not from speed, but endurance. The U-boat tombs. Out of 40,000 German submariners, only 10,000 survived. Depth charges collapsed hulls like tin cans. Many died without surfacing, their steel coffins resting forever on the Atlantic floor. They called the deep Das ewige Grab, the eternal grave. Even the sea keeps secrets it cannot speak. The bridge at Arnhem. Paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands in 1944, tasked to seize a bridge too far. They held for days against tanks, fighting from burning houses and shattered bells. When relief never came, survivors retreated through flooded fields. Thousands were captured, but their courage became legend. The bridge still stands, quiet but proud. The frozen road to hell. In Finland, soldiers battled not only men, but winter itself. Temperatures fell below -40 degrees, rifles froze, breath turned to crystals. The Finns on skis outmaneuvered Soviet troops with ghost-like speed. Even the snow seemed loyal to them. Their fight became known as the Winter War, a triumph of cunning over sheer numbers. The Island of Resistance. Crete's villagers attacked German paratroopers with farm tools and courage. It was the first major airborne invasion and the first time civilians fought back en masse. Though Crete fell, the resistance forced Hitler to abandon airborne assaults thereafter. The price was brutal reprisal, but their defiance echoed across occupied Europe. Some victories are measured in inspiration, not territory. The man with the umbrella. During the Blitz, Prime Minister Churchill toured bombed neighborhoods holding his umbrella, refusing to duck. He puffed his cigar beneath falling debris and told Londoners to keep calm and carry on. That phrase became a quiet mantra for survival. Sometimes, courage wears a bowler hat. The Blitz Nights. From 1940 to 1941, German bombers attacked Britain for 57 consecutive nights. Families slept in subway tunnels, listening to distant concussions like thunder underwater. Milkmen delivered bottles the next morning, as if the world hadn't ended. The smell of dust and tea became the scent of endurance. Britain didn't win by strength, it outlasted the dark. The hidden tunnels of Malta. The tiny island of Malta endured more bombs per square mile than anywhere else. Citizens lived underground in catacombs, carved by hand, cooking, praying, and marrying beneath rock. The island refused to surrender, blocking Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean. When the siege finally lifted, Malta was awarded the George Cross for valor. Even the smallest places can anchor the fate of empires. The nurse, called the Angel, a British nurse named Edith Cavell, helped Allied soldiers escape German-occupied Belgium. When caught, she confessed everything, saying she had no hatred or bitterness. She was executed by firing squad, and even German officers wept. Her death inspired thousands to enlist. Compassion can be more subversive than any weapon. The Polish cavalry charge. Contrary to myth, Polish horsemen did not attack tanks with sabers. They struck German infantry at dawn, routing them before armored reinforcements arrived. Propaganda twisted the tale into mockery, but witnesses remembered bravery, not folly. For many, it was the last romantic charge in modern war. Steel replaced steeds, but not spirit. The partisan forests. Across Eastern Europe, partisans hid in forests. Teachers, farmers, escaped prisoners. They sabotaged trains, cut communication lines, and vanished into the trees. Every whisper could be betrayal, every footstep a farewell. They lived like shadows, fighting so others could live like humans again. Freedom's roots grow deepest underground. The letters never sent home. Millions of letters crossed oceans during the war, each one a heartbeat trapped in paper. Some arrived years late, some never did. A few were found decades later, yellowed but still fragrant with hope. For every soldier who died, a final message often waited unopened. Even ink can outlive its author. The Red Ball Express. After D-Day, thousands of Black American drivers formed the Red Ball Express. They hauled fuel and ammunition across France day and night under constant fire. Their convoys kept Patton's tanks moving when supply lines nearly collapsed. Few outside the army knew their names, but every victory rolled on their wheels. They drove history forward while the world slept. The bridge at Remagen. In March 1945, American troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine before the Germans could destroy it. The crossing opened the path into Germany itself. Engineers worked under sniper fire to keep it standing. 10 days later, it collapsed, but by then, thousands had crossed. Sometimes a bridge only needs to last long enough. The city beneath the city. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Jews tunneled beneath the ruins to move food and weapons. Children crawled through pipes carrying bread. When the rebellion fell, many tunnels became tombs. Their bravery defied extinction itself. Even underground, the human spirit refused to hide. The soldier who refused to shoot. Desmond Doss went to war without a gun. As a medic at Okinawa, he carried 75 wounded men down a cliff under fire. He prayed between rescues, "Lord, help me get one more." He left the battlefield unarmed and unbroken, earning the Medal of Honor. Faith became his weapon, mercy his aim. The Lost Battalion. In France, 1918's shadow, another American battalion vanished in the Argonne Forest during World War II's later echoes. Surrounded, they held for days without food or ammunition until relief broke through. Radio operators tapped coordinates with trembling fingers, begging their own artillery not to miss. When rescued, only a third remained. Courage often hides in confusion. The Underground Railroad of Europe. Networks of priests, nuns, and shopkeepers smuggled Jews through occupied lands. Forged papers, attic ladders, whispered prayers, the new tools of resistance. Many rescuers were caught and executed, yet others took their place. Their quiet heroism turned ordinary streets into sanctuaries. Sometimes salvation wears an apron, not a uniform. The firebombing of Dresden. In February 1945, Allied planes rained fire on Dresden. Flames reached 1,000 degrees. The air itself caught fire. The old city vanished overnight, leaving melted streets and silence. Even survivors whispered that victory had lost its soul. Some ashes never cool. The Ghost Army's painters, artists and architects were drafted to fool the enemy. They painted fake tanks, blasted recordings of engines, and used theater lights to create phantom divisions. Their illusions saved lives by luring shells toward empty fields. War had turned art into armor. Creativity can mislead as easily as it can heal. The Night Witches. Soviet women pilots flew plywood biplanes on night raids. They cut engines mid-air to glide silently over targets, dropping bombs by hand. Germans called them Nachthexen, the Night Witches. Each sortie risked flames, flak, and freezing wind. Their broomsticks were wings of vengeance. The Siege of Manila. In 1945, the battle to free Manila destroyed the Pearl of the Orient. Japanese troops massacred civilians. American artillery leveled districts. Over 100,000 people died in a month. Liberation looked too much like ruin. Freedom arrived wearing smoke. The iron rings of Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, gold fillings and rings were melted into bars to fund the Reich. Each piece of metal was once a memory, an engagement, a promise. The furnaces took everything except guilt. When the camp was liberated, piles of ashes hid glints of gold. Even precious metals can corrode in conscience. The V-2's silent descent. Germany's V-2 rocket rose faster than sound. Londoners heard no warning, just an explosion, then emptiness. Each launch was built by slave labor in underground tunnels. The technology would later send men to the moon. The stars themselves inherited this contradiction. The nurse from Warsaw. Irina Sendler smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the ghetto. She kept their real names buried in jars beneath an apple tree. Captured and tortured, she never revealed a single child. After the war, she dug up the jars and reunited families. Her orchard became a garden of remembrance. The fall of Berlin. By April 1945, the Red Army surrounded Berlin. Civilians hid in basements as artillery thundered above. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag as fires painted the dawn red. In a bunker below, Hitler ended his life and his empire. The century exhaled. The girl in the photograph. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. One woman's kimono left its flower pattern burned into her skin. The blast erased shadows, yet preserved them on stone. She lived long enough to tell her story once. Light itself had become a weapon. The fire over Nagasaki. 3 days after Hiroshima, another bomb fell, nicknamed Fat Man. The explosion over Nagasaki flattened mountainsides and vaporized tens of thousands. Survivors spoke of a heat so bright, it erased color from the world. Within weeks, radiation sickness turned victory into remorse. The war ended, but humanity had opened its own Pandora's box. The surrender on the Missouri. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. Paper met pen, and the Second World War ended in the hush of the Pacific. Above the deck, Allied aircraft circled silently, witnesses to peace. For the first time in 6 years, the world exhaled. But every signature carried the weight of the dead. The Emperor's voice. Most Japanese citizens had never heard Emperor Hirohito speak. When his radio broadcast announced surrender, static blended with disbelief. He never used the word defeat. He simply said the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Sometimes the end of an era arrives as understatement. The mushroom cloud witnesses. Photographers at Hiroshima risked lethal radiation to capture the rising cloud. Their lenses fogged, their hands blistered, yet they documented the birth of the atomic age. Those negatives were locked away for decades, too painful to print. History needed time before it could look directly at its own reflection. The scientists' regret. After the bomb, members of the Manhattan Project petitioned for international control of nuclear power. They feared what they had proven possible. Einstein called his own discoveries a grave mistake. Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death." Genius, it turned out, could also break the heart. The burn patterns of shadows. In Hiroshima, people standing on bridges left silhouettes burned into stone. Bodies became brief shields from the light that seared everything else. These nuclear shadows remain visible even today, ghosts of a single instant. They are reminders that memory can outlast matter. The Nuremberg Dawn. In 1945, 24 Nazi leaders faced judgment in Nuremberg. For the first time, the world declared crimes against humanity. Prosecutors screened footage of liberated camps. No one in the courtroom spoke. Law tried to catch up with morality. Justice arrived not as vengeance, but vocabulary. The Tokyo trials. Across the globe, Japanese generals were tried for their own atrocities. Thousands of witnesses testified about forced labor, massacres, and medical experiments. The proceedings lasted more than 2 years. When verdicts came, silence again filled the courtroom. Truth, it seemed, required endurance equal to war itself. The rebuilding of Europe, cities once reduced to ashes, sprouted cranes and scaffolds. The Marshall Plan poured billions into reconstruction. In Berlin, children played among bricks, while adults built homes from rubble. Hope returned in cement and conversation. The continent learned to trade again instead of invade. The Berlin Airlift. When the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, Allied pilots flew food and coal into the city. They called them candy bombers, dropping chocolate bars by parachute for children. For 15 months, the sky became Berlin's highway of mercy. The blockade failed. Compassion won by altitude. It was the first victory of the Cold War fought with kindness. The displaced millions. After the war, over 40 million people wandered Europe without homes. Refugees filled camps built from the ruins of others. Families searched lists posted on church doors, hoping for a familiar name. Some never found one. Peace for many was just a different kind of exile. The birth of the United Nations. In 1945, delegates gathered in San Francisco to draft a new charter. They swore the world would never repeat its mistakes. The United Nations was born, a fragile experiment in cooperation. Its flag, a map of the earth, placed no nation above another. Idealism, reborn from rubble. The war crimes doctors. At Dachau, Nazi physicians had frozen prisoners in ice water to study hypothermia. Others injected malaria or tested altitude chambers to mimic pilots in distress. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, their notes were displayed as evidence of madness disguised as science. The Hippocratic Oath became a confession. Medicine itself had to relearn compassion. The orphans of the war. Millions of children were left without parents. Some grew up in orphanages, others in the streets, learning to barter for bread. UNICEF was founded in 1946 to feed and clothe them. Many never learned their true surnames. A lost generation that still shaped the future. The music of survival. In the years after, composers turned sorrow into sound. Benjamin Britten wrote his war requiem. Shostakovich mourned Leningrad again in symphony. Theaters reopened, violins were restrung, and silence finally found melody. Where words failed, music endured. Art began the healing that politics could not. The spies who stayed. When the war ended, not all agents went home. Former OSS and MI6 operatives slipped quietly into the new age of espionage. Old networks shifted targets from Berlin to Moscow. Friend became foe overnight. The world had traded open battlefields for invisible ones. Peace required new kinds of liars. The paperclip. Scientists. After Germany's defeat, American intelligence gathered Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. They had built V-2 rockets and chemical weapons. Now, they built NASA's future. The Cold War began with borrowed brilliance. Werner von Braun went from SS officer to space pioneer. Morality, it seemed, could also be re-engineered. The Soviet silence. In Russia, Stalin claimed victory while silencing grief. Cities lay in ruins, but parades marched anyway. Returning soldiers found their families gone or branded as traitors for being captured. The medals gleamed brighter than the bread rations. Glory made a poor meal. The Iron Curtain falls. By 1946, Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Barbed wire replaced borders. The continent divided into East and West, democracy and dictatorship. Families found themselves on opposite sides of history overnight. The war had ended by splitting the world in two. The birth of the CIA, America's OSS, dissolved into something larger, the Central Intelligence Agency. Its charter, to fight the next war before it started. Agents swapped helmets for trench coats, machine guns for microfilm. Even in peacetime, paranoia had work to do. The battlefield simply changed its dress code. The Berlin Tunnel. In 1952, Western spies dug a tunnel under East Berlin to tap Soviet phone lines. They listened for 11 months before a mole exposed the operation. The Soviets pretended ignorance to protect their own informant. The tunnel flooded, its secrets buried in mud. Truth and deceit shared the same soil. The return of the Nazi hunters. Men like Simon Wiesenthal devoted their lives to tracking escaped war criminals. They searched in monasteries, suburbs, even South America. Every trial they won was a small resurrection of justice. Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina and brought to Israel for judgment. Time could hide faces, but not guilt. The Japanese holdouts. Decades after 1945, soldiers still hid in Pacific jungles, unaware the war was over. Hiroo Onoda surrendered in 1974, 29 years later, after his former commander personally ordered him home. His rifle still worked, his uniform still pressed. He had missed televisions, spaceflight, and peace itself. Some battles end only when belief finally surrenders. The war's new frontiers. The conflict's scientists birthed radar, antibiotics, jet engines, and computing. War accelerated invention faster than any university could. The same hands that designed bombs soon designed pacemakers and airliners. Progress became a scar that healed into convenience. The world's future was welded from its shrapnel. The birth of Israel. In 1948, survivors of Europe's camps sought a homeland in Palestine. The new state of Israel emerged amid war and displacement. For many Jews, it was resurrection. For many Arabs, catastrophe. The Middle East inherited the unfinished arguments of Europe. The smoke of Auschwitz drifted farther than anyone expected. The division of Korea. Once liberated from Japan, Korea was split along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union armed the North, America the South. Within 5 years, war ignited again. The ceasefire line became a permanent scar across mountains and rice fields. World War II's embers had found new tinder. The atomic diplomats. Nuclear weapons turned diplomacy into a chess game with invisible pieces. Meetings in Geneva and Washington carried the tension of loaded guns. Every handshake had radiation behind it. The peace that followed was balanced on mutual fear. Civilization learned to live beside its own extinction. The veterans returned. Millions of soldiers came home to find the world impatiently moving on. They built suburbs, studied on the GI Bill, tried to forget what couldn't be forgotten. Nightmares shared bedrooms with baby cribs. Whole generations learned to keep silent. The war lingered behind closed eyes. The women who stayed. While men fought, women worked in factories and offices. When peace came, many were told to return home. Some did. Others refused, reshaping economies and expectations. Rosie the Riveter became both memory and prophecy. The front line had quietly moved indoors. The songs of memory. Post-war radio hummed with melodies of absence. Songs like We'll Meet Again and Lily Marlene traveled farther than armies ever did. They comforted widows, inspired lovers, and haunted veterans. Music became the only language everyone understood. Even silence learned the tune. The Phoenix cities. Tokyo and Hiroshima rose from rubble into skylines of light. Architects designed parks where craters once smoked. Every steel beam became an apology to the sky. Japan's industry resurrected faster than anyone thought possible. Factories that once made weapons now made radios, cars, and peace offerings. Rebirth became the nation's true miracle. The German miracle. In the 1950s, West Germany rebuilt with a speed that startled even its allies. The Marshall Plan and tireless labor forged new cities atop the ashes of old. Streets once patrolled by soldiers, filled with students and bicycles. Guilt turned into work, and work into renewal. Germany learned that reconstruction is a form of repentance. The Soviet wound. Behind the Iron Curtain, Russia's countryside still bore the war's scars. Fields hid mines beneath wild flowers. Villages never replaced their dead. While parades boasted victory, the peasants remembered only famine and frost. Decades later, bones still surfaced after heavy rains. The earth had learned the habit of remembering. The war in film. Hollywood rebuilt the story of the war frame by frame. Movies like The Bridge on the River Kwai and The Great Escape offered heroism where history had left grief. For audiences, it was therapy. For veterans, déjà vu. Cameras turned memory into myth. The lens made everything survivable again. The Diary of Anne Frank. Found in an Amsterdam attic, her diary spoke for millions who couldn't. Anne wrote of fear, love, and the wish to be understood. Her words outlived every wall meant to contain them. Translated into dozens of languages, her voice became the conscience of the 20th century. Sometimes history's loudest voice belongs to a child's pen. The landmines that waited. Even decades after peace, farmers in France and Belgium unearthed shells. They called it the Iron Harvest, the soil's cruel memory. Each spring brought explosions as plows struck forgotten bombs. The war, it seemed, had planted itself. Peace still demanded caution underfoot. The architects of peace. Old enemies signed trade pacts and defense alliances. The European coal and steel community bound former rivals by industry rather than ideology. It evolved into the European Union, proof that cooperation could grow from catastrophe. The continent found stability not in power, but partnership. Shared wealth replaced shared wounds. The return of the Emperor's soldiers. When Japan renounced war in its new constitution, soldiers came home to disbanded armies. Many felt relief, others loss. The sword had been taken from the nation's hand. Samurai descendants traded uniforms for briefcases. Honor redefined itself in quiet industry. The Memory Museum. From London to Berlin to Hiroshima, museums began to curate the unthinkable. Visitors walked among uniforms, letters, and ashes behind glass. The exhibits were less about pride than prevention. Every display whispered the same question: how did this happen? Remembrance became a civic duty. The language of acronyms. World War II gave rise to everyday shorthand: radar, jeep, sonar, zip code. The language of logistics became the language of life. Military precision infiltrated peacetime speech. Even bureaucracy carried traces of battle. The war changed how we spoke, not just what we said. The echo in technology. Every convenience carried a wartime ancestor. Microwave ovens evolved from radar, computers from code breaking, synthetic fabrics from parachutes. Our daily lives became unintentional memorials to conflict. Peace borrowed its tools from war. The cold peace of occupation. For years, Allied soldiers remained in Germany and Japan as guardians of reform. They helped rebuild schools and newspapers, taught democracy one town at a time. Some married locals, some never left. Occupation blurred into friendship. The victors stayed long enough to become neighbors. The forgotten fronts. Beyond Europe and the Pacific, smaller wars burned in Burma, Ethiopia, and China. Millions died without headlines or monuments. For them, the world's second war was their first and last. Maps couldn't fit every story. History's focus is as narrow as a camera lens. The healing through art. Artists who survived painted ruins with impossible colors. Picasso's doves replaced his shattered bodies. Kandinsky found peace in abstraction. Even poster designers turned propaganda into design movements. Beauty became rebellion against despair. Color itself was a declaration that the dark had passed. The pilgrims of memory. Decades later, tourists stood on beaches where thousands died. They collected sand, listened to wind, tried to imagine chaos in calm. Some brought descendants of the fallen. Even silence there feels heavy with gratitude. The world began to visit its own ghosts. The birth of human rights. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Drafted by survivors and diplomats, it began with one promise: all human beings are born free and equal. The horrors of the war gave it urgency. Its words would inspire revolutions, reforms, and resistance. Law tried again to catch up with compassion. The rise of the peacekeepers. Blue helmets replaced bayonets. The United Nations formed peacekeeping forces to stand between future enemies. They carried rifles, but rarely fired them. Their strength was in presence, not power. Humanity had finally invented soldiers, meant not to fight. The shadows of censorship. Governments across the world had learned propaganda's power. Post-war nations now censored not to deceive enemies, but to protect morale. Films and textbooks softened the blood. History became negotiation between memory and myth. Truth was once again drafted into service. The refuge of the displaced arts. Europe's art had been scattered, hidden in mines, castles, even barns. After victory, the monument's men hunted down stolen masterpieces. They found Da Vinci's in salt caverns and Rembrandt's behind walls. Returning each painting was like returning a soul. Civilization itself had been looted and rescued. The War of Memory. Each nation wrote its own version of events. In one, every soldier was a hero. In another, every loss was betrayal. Textbooks became new battlefields. The past demanded editors as much as it did witnesses. History, too, learned to wear uniforms. The birth of the baby boom. When soldiers came home, so did life. Hospitals overflowed with newborns, hope taking human form. Suburbs spread like soft applause across the countryside. The world seemed ready to rebuild in diapers and daylight. For a moment, peace was louder than war. The television generation. Television arrived as the war ended, bringing both comfort and confrontation. Families gathered around screens glowing with optimism, but newsreels showed concentration camps and mushroom clouds. For the first time, horror and hope shared the same frame. The living room became the new front line of awareness. The Great Migration. The war uprooted millions, but it also opened doors. In America, Black veterans returned, determined to fight segregation. The GI Bill gave them education and mobility, planting seeds of civil rights. The march from Normandy led quietly to Selma. Justice found its next battlefield at home. The birth of the welfare state. Governments realized that security meant more than armies. Britain founded its National Health Service in 1948. Other nations followed with social programs, pensions, and safety nets. Out of destruction grew the blueprint for dignity. Compassion became infrastructure. The cold art of deterrence. The nuclear age brought new vocabulary, mutually assured destruction. Peace depended on fear, balance maintained by threat. The bomb had ended one war only by promising another. Children practiced hiding under desks, learning safety as ritual. Anxiety became the new anthem. The German question. For decades, Germany remained divided between East and West. Families sent letters across walls guarded by rifles. East Berliners whispered forbidden songs, while West Berliners broadcast freedom by radio. Reunification would take 45 years. Patience became the quietest rebellion. The bomb shelters of suburbia. In the 1950s, families built bunkers beside barbecues. Children stocked canned beans and flashlights like toys. The world had learned how to fear invisibly. Above ground, lawns stayed perfect. Below, panic waited. Even comfort learned to crouch. The scientists of space. The war's rocket engineers pointed their eyes upward. The Cold War's race for orbit grew from blueprints meant for destruction. Sputnik beeped across the sky like a ghost of the V-2. Every launch was both triumph and warning. Humanity had taken its conflict into the stars. The long goodbye of empire. Europe's colonial powers returned home weakened. Across Asia and Africa, independence movements ignited. The war's rhetoric of freedom could no longer be contained abroad. Within decades, old empires dissolved like mirages. The world map finally began to sound honest. The return of the Holocaust survivors. Those who lived came back to find no homes waiting. Neighbors had moved in, names erased from mailboxes. Yet many rebuilt their lives, opening shops, writing memoirs, teaching tolerance. Each survivor carried both trauma and testimony. They became living libraries against forgetting. The children of the bomb, the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, raised children shadowed by radiation. Many faced illness, others stigma, yet they became activists, turning suffering into advocacy for disarmament. Their voices joined across oceans, teaching that endurance could outlive even fallout. Pain learned to speak in peace. The hidden camps of Siberia. In Stalin's gulags, returning Soviet POWs were branded traitors. They were sent to labor camps frozen in perpetual dusk. No parades greeted them, only pickaxes. The same empire that claimed victory also swallowed its own soldiers. War's cruelty survived under a new uniform. The healing of Japan. In post-war Tokyo, American generals helped draft a constitution renouncing war forever. The emperor became human again, his divinity stripped away. Japan rebuilt on education, technology, and restraint. Its pacifism became both penance and protection. Redemption found form in factories and classrooms. The Italian reckoning. Italy switched sides before the war's end, its people torn between fascism and survival. After liberation, citizens hunted Mussolini and hanged him in Milan Square. The image haunted Europe's conscience. Tyranny, literally, upside down. It was the photograph that said, "Never again." Justice sometimes needs to look directly at its reflection. The women of Warsaw. Female couriers and fighters carried pistols under skirts and intelligence in handbags. They ferried messages through sewers, tended the wounded, and sometimes led uprisings. Many were executed, others vanished into exile. Their courage was often omitted from history books written by men. Freedom had more faces than medals. The long silence of veterans. For decades, soldiers refused to speak of what they'd seen. Some built quiet lives, others drowned their ghosts in work or whiskey. Only when grandsons asked did they begin to answer. Their confessions arrived like late mail. Healing waits for permission. The teachers of memory. Holocaust educators carried slideshows into classrooms where students yawned at dates. But when survivors unrolled tattooed sleeves, the room always fell still. The numbers on their arms turned history into presence. Each retelling was an act of defiance against forgetfulness. Stories became the final form of resistance. The Cold War propaganda posters. Artists from both sides drew the world in slogans and smiles. In Moscow, doves flew over tractors. In Washington, freedom wore lipstick. Design itself became ideology. When the ink dried, the truth looked suspiciously well printed. Even beauty learned to take sides. The Trials of Tokyo Rose. A Japanese-American woman, Eva Toguri, was accused of being the radio traitor, Tokyo Rose. She'd only played music and read scripted broadcasts. Convicted in hysteria, she was later pardoned when evidence proved her innocence. The voice of the enemy turned out to be the voice of home. Truth sometimes requires decades of listening. The Berlin Wall's first brick. Erected overnight in 1961, the wall sliced through families and friendships. Guards fired at those trying to cross, the rest watched from rooftops. For 28 years, concrete replaced trust. When it finally fell, people chipped away pieces like holy relics. Every fragment carried both grief and relief. The reunion of enemies. Decades later, former Allied and German pilots met at air shows. They shared coffee, not gunfire. Old opponents traded stories about clouds, fear, and luck. Each realized the other had only been doing what duty demanded. Time had rewritten the definition of enemy. The monuments of absence. Across Europe, new memorials rose not to glorify, but to grieve. Stumbling stones embedded in sidewalks marked former Jewish homes. Each bore a name, a date, and silence. Commemoration became decentralized, humble, everywhere underfoot. Memory learned to hide in plain sight. The Vietnamese parallel. When America entered Vietnam, veterans' fathers recognized the rhythm. Jungle rot replaced trench foot, and propaganda repeated itself in new accents. The lessons of one war were filed away too neatly to prevent the next. History's echo chamber was perfectly tuned. Wars rarely end, they migrate. The psychologist's new word. After the war, doctors coined post-traumatic stress. Once dismissed as shell shock, it became recognized as invisible injury. Hospitals filled with minds still fighting their private battles. Naming the pain didn't end it, but it began the cure. Language became medicine. The fall of the wall. In 1989, crowds with hammers and hope tore through concrete and history. Berliners danced where soldiers once stood guard. Families embraced under snowflakes of plaster. The Cold War thawed not with weapons, but with songs. Freedom proved contagious. The reunion at Normandy. On the beaches where they once fought, veterans met again, this time as grandfathers. They shook hands across tides that had carried both courage and fear. Some wept, others laughed. The waves that once brought death now washed over friendship. The sea had learned forgiveness. The cameras of witness. Modern documentaries reopened history's wounds with empathy instead of judgment. Black and white footage turned living once more as narrators whispered context between silences. Audiences cried decades late. Memory became entertainment, but also education. Film had finally learned reverence. The DNA of the missing. Forensic science began identifying soldiers long lost. Bones exhumed from foreign fields returned home with names again. Families gathered at graves decades overdue. Technology restored closure where letters could not. The dead had waited patiently for progress. The digital battlefields. Historians digitized diaries, photos, and maps for future generations. Archives went online, turning private sorrow into public record. Students clicked through lives once left unread. The war migrated to hard drives, safer, searchable, still sacred. Remembrance found Wi-Fi. The apologies. Nations began to say sorry, formally, publicly, painfully. Germany to its victims, Japan to its neighbors, America for its camps. Each apology was imperfect, yet necessary. History bowed its head, not its flag. Contrition became a kind of diplomacy. The children who asked why. School children across the world began to ask their grandparents what the war was like. At kitchen tables, stories spilled, ones too heavy to tell before. Some were small kindnesses, others unbearable truths. Each question reopened a door no one knew still existed. Curiosity turned out to be history's best inheritance. The art of the apologists. Contemporary artists used ashes, steel, and silence as mediums. Memorial sculptures cast shadows shaped like the missing. Installations whispered instead of shouted. Art had stopped illustrating war and started interrogating it. Beauty became a way of remembering without glamour. The letters to nowhere. Decades after the war, unopened mail was discovered in postal warehouses. Love letters, promotions, condolences, frozen in envelopes. Archivists read them like sacred texts. The paper had yellowed, but emotion had not. Even undelivered words fulfill their purpose eventually. The sleep of cities. Modern skylines glow where blackouts once cloaked fear. Night is no longer a warning, but a window. The hum of peace is electric, restless, and fragile. Every neon sign stands upon history's ashes. Civilization still dreams under the same uneasy stars. The last veterans. As the century turned, the soldiers of World War II began to fade away. Their medals tarnished, their uniforms shrank in closets. Each funeral left fewer first-hand witnesses. Soon the stories would belong only to paper and film. Time became the final survivor. The museums of humanity. Across continents, memorials now preserve empathy itself. Visitors walk through replicas of barracks and bunkers, feeling the weight of history press against the air. It's no longer about nations, but about people. Grief has become global. Every culture now keeps its candle for the same darkness. The modern soldier's reflection. Young troops in modern conflicts carry inherited ghosts. They study past wars for lessons, then repeat them with different flags. Each generation swears it will be the last to learn this way. War remains fluent in every language. History's accent never fades. The weight of silence, the farther the war drifts into history, the heavier its silence becomes. Memorial days grow quieter, survivors fewer. The danger now is forgetting through fatigue. Memory must work harder than myth. Every generation inherits the obligation to remember. The world that watched itself. Today, footage of the 1940s still circulates online, endlessly replayed. Each click is both curiosity and prayer. We watch strangers die so that we might recognize ourselves. History has become its own surveillance. The past still observes the present. The quiet lesson. World War II ended long ago, yet never leaves. It sleeps beneath highways, in family albums, in the vocabulary of nations. Its true legacy is not victory, but vigilance. To remember is to refuse repetition. The war is over, so long as we keep it that way.